Hello, I'm Dr. King Owen, and here's another quick review for APUSH. This time, we will try to tackle period 5 in 4 slides or less. This is the period leading up to the Civil War, and then the war itself, followed by putting the country back together, 1848 to 1877. Our first theme is the expansion of America to the West, which becomes a major catalyst for the Civil War. Manifest Destiny, sort of the early version of imperialism, was this idea that the West was God-given to Americans, that Americans had a duty to go and take these Western lands in order to civilize them. And as a result of adding territories to the US, it increased tensions between the North and South over the expansion of slavery. A great example of that is the Mexican War, a war that began over the disputed boundary with Texas and then ended with the US acquiring New Mexico, Arizona, California, which then led to the question, shall slavery go into these new lands? Will these lands be open to slave owners? Or will they be free soil areas? The expansion to the West was also driven by a desire to be more likely to capture Asian markets. Although the US had been trading with Asian markets since the 1780s, in the 1850s, we will see the US break through the Japanese market, literally break through by force, as Commodore Matthew Perry threatens to blow them up unless they trade with the United States. And this Western expansion will also be furthered by the Republicans, who will use the time period of the Civil War to add to the ability of Americans to go west through a transcontinental railroad. So this Western expansion will not stop in the period, and even though we will take time to focus on the Civil War, keep in mind that these processes of moving west continue even while people's attention is focused on war. The expansion to the west through the Transcontinental Railroad will open up the ability of Americans to go west pretty rapidly, and they will be encouraged to go west by a Homestead Act, which will grant 160 acres to people willing to go to Western lands to settle. Finally, the US government will also support this through a process of rounding up Native peoples in order to force them onto reservations. Our second theme of period 5 is the political realignment that will drive the two-party system closer to civil war. As the 1850s are unfolding, there's a brief flirtation with nativism, especially in northern urban areas, because those areas had experienced an influx of Irish and German immigrants in the 1830s and 40s. So the Know Nothing Party builds a base in northern cities and briefly distracts northerners with tales of immigrants being a threat to American democracy. But there's also the growing anti-slavery sentiment that is rapidly capturing Northerners' attention, especially in the wake of things like the Compromise of 1850. Keep in mind, this anti-slavery set of views is not pro-African American, it's really pro-white, meaning most Northerners see slavery as a threat to their own interests, their own lives, their own political processes. And so when they adopt a free soil ideology, what they are doing is not adopting abolitionism for the sake of helping African Americans. And this free soil ideology will result in the creation of a Republican Party as the Whig Party is starting to be pulled apart. Northern Whigs, dissatisfied with the sort of the direction that the country is headed in terms of slavery. Southern Whigs saying that slavery is not being protected and so voting more Democrat. And this will be stronger after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which actually launches the creation of the Republican Party. That act would have allowed slavery to expand into northern areas of the West, northern areas that had, up to this point, been blocked from having slavery. So Northerners are now angry that slavery is extending itself into places where it hadn't been allowed before and threatening the interests of white Northerners. African Americans, white abolitionists, are continuing to press the issue of anti-slavery, but consider that they are a minority of voices when compared to this larger free soil opinion about slavery's relationship to the future of the United States. Meanwhile, Southerners are hardening, seriously honing in on their states' rights point of view, the states' rights to own slaves, their sectionalist identity as the Democratic Party defends slavery, and that slavery is a positive good. It is the best system, not just for whites, but even for African Americans. And that identity of the South is becoming secure against Northern criticisms that slavery is anti-modern and anti-democratic and anti the future of where the U.S. is headed as an industrializing nation. The catalyst for a lot of these debates about slavery and leading to political realignment is really expansion to the West. Several historians have made the argument without Western lands, there wouldn't have been a concrete issue for the two parties to fight over. And that concrete issue allowed the North and the South to project their fears and their anxieties over slavery into these Western lands. And that eventually will drive the country into disunion. Our third theme will be the war itself. The war, as far as battles go, is never really important for the AP exam. What's really more important is how the two societies mobilize to fight and how the purpose of the war itself evolves. The mobilization of the two sides is a tale of the North's overwhelming material advantages. It's got more money, more railroads, more industry, more people, even more agriculture. The South has better generals, a belief that, you know, a Southerner can beat 3 Yankees, and the South also believes, you know, in the superiority of cotton and using cotton as a diplomatic tool. But in time, we will see that the winner is the one who can outlast the other. And the North is simply able to outlast the South. By 1864, the North will also wage a total war against the South. Not just war on armies, but a war on Southern society itself. So General Sherman, famously, for example, will march to the sea, destroying railroads, robbing Confederates of their resources, robbing Confederate homes in order to break their will to resist. And that will contribute to a lot of discontent and dissatisfaction in the Confederacy. The war's purpose also changes. President Lincoln starts the war with a public pledge that the war is going to be about preserving the Union. We will keep the Union together. We'll not allow it to be broken apart over the issue of slavery. So publicly he says this. Many other Republicans see the war as a chance to deal a final blow to the idea of slavery. And Lincoln moves cautiously to that idea by 1863 with the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then his Gettysburg Address, also announcing a new birth of freedom for African Americans. As Lincoln himself realizes that the war is not just about preserving the Union, but Lincoln's a lawyer, and so he's very cautious, and he moves pretty slowly in dealing with the issue of slavery during the war. Part of the thing that gets overlooked is that African Americans themselves are emancipating themselves and their families. It's not just a rescuing by a benevolent bunch of Northern Republicans. The Emancipation Proclamation really frees no one. It's not like a Southerner is going to read it and go, oh, well, I guess I better let my enslaved property go now. So in order to be free, African Americans run away from the South. And that puts pressure on the North to figure out what to do with them. Eventually, Northern Republicans will agree to let African Americans join the Union Army. And who better to fight and beat Southerners than people with a really big stake in their own freedom? And of course, it robs the South of their labor supply and makes it harder for the Southerners to maintain their economy. The South also tried to put some, weight behind cotton as a diplomatic tool to get Europe to help them. And so they famously engaged in cotton diplomacy in the early years of the war, but neither England nor France were really wanting to get involved in this war over slavery, and they were not willing to sort of bite over this issue of cotton. So England, famously, for example, will find cotton in other places, even though there is a shipyard that does build 3 Confederate ships. Many European countries rely heavily on northern grain production, and so alienating the North doesn't seem to be a smart move just to help a bunch of Southerners preserve the institution of slavery, which doesn't exist in England or France. So why would England or France want to be involved? Theme 4. Putting the country back together again. So Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Then came the Civil War, and Humpty had a great big fall. The story of putting Humpty Dumpty, the United States, back together was a story that began first with Lincoln and his Vice President Johnson, soon to be President Johnson, because Lincoln conceived of reconstructing the nation as a president's job. If war is the president's job, then Reconstruction is the president's job. In the beginning, Lincoln and Johnson did adopt the idea that slavery would have to go. So as part of their Reconstruction thoughts, they imposed upon the South the demand that Southerners agree to the end of slavery before they could be readmitted to the Union. But radical Republicans, angry at Lincoln and later Johnson, decided that ending slavery was not enough. They did not see in the South any remorse for the war, as evidenced by the fact that Southerners re-elected Confederates to Congress after the war was over. And so radical Republicans seized the day, so to speak, to punish the South and push the issues of civil rights even further than just abolition of slavery. So they pushed for the citizenship of ex-slaves That's the 14th Amendment, and you do need to know which amendment is which. So the 14th is about citizenship and equality under the law. And then the 15th Amendment will be about voting rights for African American males, not women. So keep in mind, men get the right to vote in the United States before women will. And this really ticks off women who had helped the abolitionist movement. Over time, though, the North will retreat back away from the protection of African American civil rights during Reconstruction. There is a panic in 1873. There are scandals in President Grant's administration. And so the Northern will to keep fighting starts receding. Southerners will begin to, quote unquote, redeem the South from the rule of African Americans. And the Supreme Court will actually back them by limiting the effectiveness, sort of drawing some boundaries around the 14th and the 15th Amendments. So we'll see Supreme Court cases that will effectively limit equality under the law and voting rights for African Americans. I'd also like to point out that the story of African American power after this conflict is not just about legal change, not just about like changing the amendments and the laws, but also about economic power. And Frederick Douglass was particularly acute to this when he noted that it takes money to build a base of power from which you can then act politically. He said, you know, where masters retained the power to starve, they retained, you know, the institution of slavery. And so most African Americans ended up as sharecroppers, not owning their own land. So if you don't own your own land, you don't have any politically, you don't have any economically independent basis on which to be political. And sharecropping almost became like a form of enslavement in that the debts generated under sharecropping get passed on from generation to generation. There's also an incredible amount of violence. Terror, intimidation are tactics used by Southerners to suppress any African Americans who try to be political or try to act on their rights. So the creation of the KKK will lead to a suppression of power of African Americans. There will be attacks on African Americans who attempt to vote, who attempt to defend their rights. And by the 1880s, we'll see the use of Jim Crow laws to suppress African Americans and to take away their voting rights and to segregate them from society at large. This is why historian Eric Foner calls Reconstruction an unfinished revolution. It's the start of something that swells, offers promise to Black Americans, and then the door is shut after 1877. This has been our look at Period 5, Western expansion, the breakdown of the political system over the issue of slavery, the Civil War, and then reconstructing the nation are our 4 elements. See you next time for another quick review.